Clinical data is a phenomenal thing, although unfortunately clinical data is, fragmented, we know that. But lived experience can link up that data and it can make patient journeys make sense to people, really rationalise patient journeys. As we move to moving care into the community and we start to put more autonomy and agency onto patients, we need to realise how much of this patient journey takes form at home. I think that is something that people don't realise, is that we are collecting clinical data whilst they are there in the hospital, whilst they are there for checkups. That is just a snapshot of that patient's life. The real recovery and the real self-management and what determines whether they develop diabetes or not, these things all take place at home, and that is the insight that currently healthcare systems do not have. That is where they can fill in that data gap to make sure that we are actually creating something worth value.
Olivia, welcome to the Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. Super excited for this. You are doing some amazing stuff. You're an entrepreneur, you're a patient, as we are all patients, as we've just been discussing offline, actually. And you are connected into what I think I and many people who look at health tech more broadly and healthcare more broadly would consider a very progressive mentality, and you're part of the future in terms of how you feel about how patients are going to interact with, I would say, the business side of the healthcare system, the health tech side of the system. And there's just some interesting things that we can talk about with how patients are going to be integrated at a more operational and higher level of healthcare, as they already are, may I add. So delighted to have you, Olivia. And for the benefit of our listeners, why don't you tell us a bit of your story?
Of course. So I think my interest in healthcare innovation really started from birth. So I was born with a rare congenital heart condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which is a super interesting condition if anybody wants to research it outside of this podcast. And I became one of the first patients in the UK to undergo the surgical journey to managing that condition. So I had 3 open heart surgeries and then other surgeries on top of that to basically reconstruct my heart and circumnavigate my circulation in order to be here today. I was then discharged from Birmingham Women's and Children's Hospital at age 18, and I actually started by doing a degree in fashion. And after that degree in fashion, I decided to use my lived experience and my, business and fashion experience. And I designed a more dignified, sustainable and cost-effective hospital gown and launched my company, Hypoplas. And we won Innovate UK grants. We got grants from the University of Manchester, Santander. I became one of the first patients to go onto the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Programme. I won the Women's Thai Global competition and got sent out to India to pitch my business on the global stage.
Wow.
And we work really closely with the NHS about, bringing an improved patient experience to healthcare, to patients in general. So then I went back to university and I studied my MBA at the UCL Global Business School for Health. I received the Future Leaders Scholarship to study there. Recently became the UK ambassador for the business school as well. And that's really when I got into the business side of healthcare and really started looking at, the future trends that were up and coming and how patients and how health tech are really going to interact moving forward. And then that's when I moved into more of a consultancy role, and I started being hired by multiple health tech startups and, even monoliths as well. I work with pharmaceutical companies as well, and I really work at that commercialization side, bringing innovation into healthcare systems. And, I'm very fortunate, obviously I have a lived experience, but I'm very much taken seriously, and I do get to work at that C-suite level and within the operations of these companies. And also, was recently brought onto the innovation committee at the UK DHC as well. So, I really work at that high level of bringing health tech innovation. I work in bits of policy as well, and infrastructure, and just making sure not only the patient voice is there and the lived experience is there, but like you said, James, at the beginning, it's become more and more common sense, as it were, to place patients in these positions, considering the direction of that healthcare is going in.
Yeah, common sense. It's interesting, and business sense. And also, I would say, I was going to say moral sense, but it's almost like, it's like obvious that what do we want? What are we doing this for? What are we in healthcare for? Why do we even do healthcare? Why do we even have a healthcare system? It's to make a certain group of people, i.e. patients, and we can all be patients at various different times, various different ways, feel better. And is it not, therefore, completely obvious and clear that when it comes to advisory on the quality of care, that, to say the least, the quality of care, let alone all the component parts, and we'll talk about commercial and bits, that we have advisory from that perspective. So it seems that we need to check ourselves in what we do this for. And I actually see this argument play out a lot. I'm seeing this play out in so many different areas of health tech that actually, and you being an expert in commercialization of stuff as well, and you may have noticed with your company, it's very difficult to build a business case around this just makes patients feel better, or this just makes patients or clinicians or staff feel better. Because if it doesn't save time or make money somewhere, what's the ROI in better dignity for patients?
Yeah.
It's so difficult. And actually, maybe let's start there. So with your business, the idea for it, lived experience clearly, but talk me through that. I'm really interested in how you go from an idea to actually building a business in this, and actually, some of that commercialization journey.
Yeah. So obviously it always starts with the design. So first of all, we had to make sure the design was correct for patients. But then the more and more I got into the design side of it, and the more I started to work with trusts, nurses, doctors, clinicians, I started to realize that there was not only patients who had a real gripe with the generic hospital gown. We were looking at clinicians hated it as well. It was
interesting,
stopping them from getting, cannulas, catheters, drains. They couldn't get access. Yeah, they couldn't get access. Things like when you went into the pre-op room, you anesthetized that patient. They couldn't get the gown off the patient to then put the patient drapes on. So,
100%.
Yeah. So we were seeing such inefficiency at the clinician level.
Yeah.
Then we looked at it from a healthcare system level, and this when it got quite scary, to be honest with you. We were then looking at what was happening with the double gowning. So we were then seeing patients having to wear a gown front and back in order to be walked down to surgery. So we were talking to procurement, and they were saying, this is the price that we pay for every single gown. Then we were going to the level of, the front line, and we were seeing that was not the price they were paying. They were paying for two gowns per one patient.
Wow.
Then we had things like in cardiac arrest, when we saw gowns were being ripped open, scissors down the middle to get access. We were seeing ties were getting too tight, were getting cut off. That whole gown got sent into textile waste, which then went into landfill or got burnt. That's not cheap either. And then who pays for that gown to come back onto the ward? The trust or the healthcare system.
Wow.
Okay. So then we were seeing that we were actually looking at quite a big financial hole. Then we were looking at quite a big sustainability hole, because if you're wearing double gowning, that's double laundering, that's double carbon, that's double water. If you're having to break these gowns and take them off the ward, you're having to ship a whole new bunch of gowns from China to replace those. Yeah. And these gowns are not being repaired. They're not being sent anywhere. They're going straight into landfill. So this is when it got quite scary, that this was not just a patient thing. It was a clinician thing. then it was a procurement thing, then it was a whole healthcare system. I don't want to look at what the calculations are of what this black hole could be. But if you think about something so simple as a hospital gown, so simple, yet it can create a multi-million-pound black hole because of the inefficiencies of it. But we are stuck in this circle of, yes, it helps patients, and it's unfortunate. We show them the data, we show them what the potentialities and things like that, but because let's face it, we're not curing cancer, we're not increasing people's life expectancy, things like that, we are being put on the back burner. But I feel positive about, I was speaking before about there will be a positive ending to this. And, I do believe that, we will all be wearing one of these gowns in the future, because like I said, it comes back to that common sense. This is now becoming common sense to make these things and bring these innovations into healthcare systems.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And it's some of those use cases you mentioned, like I've lived through those from the clinician side. And it's crazy that actually even me with a, relatively sort of innovator hat on, when I was practicing, I never even would have thought about the gown. It's one of those things that you just assume is entrenched within the system, that you just assume you can't change that. That's the bit of the hospital I don't really understand. If you start talking about devices and you start talking about the clinical operations and all the rest of it, then I can try and find some clever things there. Whereas actually, stuff like the gown, it's just staring you in the face. And you're right. There's the dignity thing as well. I think adds to cognitive load for the patient massively, and the clinicians actually as well, because you're especially if you're a relatively empathic clinician, you're feeling for them in those moments as well, and going out of your way to try and make them feel comfortable. And it feels like anesthetics as well. It sounds like you've done your research on this massively, but in the anesthetic room, there's real clinical value to making someone feel as relaxed as possible, because it actually makes your anesthetic better and your anesthetic easier. If someone's really on edge because of whatever reason, that the gown just isn't providing them that dignity, whether that's personal beliefs or just how they feel and who they are, or religious beliefs, or whatever it is, like it's a really difficult thing for people, and to be able to then redesign it around not only helping with dignity, but all of those things that add the commercial value, then you can start to sort of Trojan horse the bits that don't have the ROI of just increasing dignity, etc. You can actually start to Trojan horse that in via, we're going to make this save some money or make some money or whatever it is, which I think is a lot more interesting.
Yeah. And I think to go back to that safeguarding question, people don't know how bad it is getting. I mean, I know because I lived through it, but to be a 12-year-old girl, or a 14-year-old girl, and you are being walked down to the operating theatre through, a corridor which has open access to other, people. You're wearing a see-through gown, you're conscious of your body, and then you walk into a room, a pre-op room, you're surrounded by maybe 4 men you've never met before. They're about to put you to sleep. This is chilling.
The vulnerability is just enormous, isn't it?
And that is what really, I don't want to say hurts me, but that's what I find devastating, is that we cannot put ourselves in that shoe of that 14-year-old girl, or say you're a 75-year-old man, you've always been proud, you've always earned for the family, you're the man of the house, and then someone puts you in that open back see-through gown and they force you to walk through a corridor, and all of a sudden everything that you've built over that 75 years is just gone within a second and taken away from you. It's not just dignity, it's humanity at that point.
It's really interesting you say that. So this just reminded me of a story of my dad. So my dad had technically a stroke, really a TIA that lasted a couple of extra hours, but and he had it in France, and he went to the French hospital and had all the tests. Turned out he had a blood clot in his neck. So a very reversible, I guess, reason to have a stroke. So one of the better reasons, I guess, because he had for people that are listening that might not know, a procedure called an endarterectomy, where they're going to go in and remove the clot from the neck and reroute the artery, etc., with some plastic tubing. So he had that, and bearing in mind that I'm his son, I'm a doctor, I do not recall any time of visiting him in hospital that he allowed me to see him in a gown. He get massively against all advice. I can remember after his operation, even he literally the day after, I got there expecting him to see me, but I mean the guy was still a little bit drowsy, I think, and he was fully dressed. I mean, like fully dressed, because he's a proud man, exactly as you've just described. And if he's willing to go to that effort, and you know, frankly, you know, he's a man, he had autonomy to do that. He's an adult. When I now put that level of anxiety in the lengths that he was willing to go to, and then you think about those 12-year-old girls that can't do that because they don't have the bodily autonomy to actually change the situation that they're in. They can't refuse. They can't do any of those things. It's almost like the legality of it even comes to my mind, of like how legal is that? Like to sort of have someone in a public space that you're kind of forcing them to walk through in a gown. Like, it does not feel okay.
It's not. And I think, you know, I'll be open about it. That's something I have to live with. You know, I was walked down that corridor multiple times to go to that operating theatre in that gown, and I have to live with that cognitive load, you know. And to go back to your dad, is that, you know, when you go through a surgery, it is traumatic. And to think he's got on his mind, I need to get up, I need to get dressed, my son's coming to see me, blah, blah, blah. You don't need it. You know, you're still in this recovery mode. You're still, you know, recovering from, you know, surgery, and surgery is painful, you know what I mean? And you're trying to get yourself dressed. You've got, you know, I need to do this. I'm proud. I'm this person. This is my identity. So it's just such a mental burden that we don't need to be putting on patients at all.
Agreed. One thing that came to my mind then as well is that when you think about the sort of importance of fixing a problem in this scenario, my dad was willing. He just had vascular surgery on his neck. One of the biggest issues with that being that post-surgery you can just throw off a clot and have a stroke. Bearing in mind, my dad was a chief nursing officer of a region in the UK. So he worked as a nurse like most of his career. He was a cardiac nurse a lot of his career, actually. He was willing to overcome those risks that he was actually more informed of than anyone else. He was actually willing to overcome those in order to get dressed. And that's how important it was to him.
Exactly.
So, like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we consider what you do now in other spheres and offering the patient voice, it's saying things like this, I imagine, of, do you understand the level of importance that we need to assign to this thing that you might not think has that level of importance? Because actually there's clinical risk. If we don't fix the dignity issue, you've got people with an endarterectomy throwing themselves out of bed, throwing their arms up into a jumper when they can just throw off a clot like there's no tomorrow. Like, do we realize that there's clinical risk here? And actually, you know, even saying that out loud then, like, I've not considered that before, ever. And a patient representative perhaps would have told me that.
And I think it's linking the data gaps. You know, clinical data is a phenomenal thing, although unfortunately clinical data is, you know, fragmented. We know that. But lived experience can link up that data, and it can make patient journeys make sense to people. You know, it can really rationalize patient journeys, really rationalize the steps that patients have to go through, what they, you know. And I think also this is one thing that, you know, as we move to moving care into the community, and we move into self-monitoring, self-management, all of these things, and we start to put more, you know, I want to say autonomy and agency onto patients, we need to realize how much of this patient journey takes form at home. You know, I
Yeah.
think that is something that people don't
Yeah.
realize, is that we are collecting clinical data whilst they are there in the hospital, whilst they are there for checkups. That is just a snapshot of that patient's life. The real recovery and the real self-management and what determines whether they develop diabetes or not, these things all take place at home. And that is the insight that currently healthcare systems do not have. It's also the insight that health tech companies do not have, is that journey that takes place at home. And that is where someone with lived experience who has been through that recovery journey, that is where they can fill in that data gap to make sure that we are actually creating something worth value, you know,
Yes.
worth of value that is valuable to patients, clinicians, healthcare sectors, healthcare systems. And the more data you have, the more you can iterate, the more you can, you know, create more value, more effect, more purpose. So I think that's really where patients will come into that key part, is that journey into the home.
Nice. So a bit of a more broad question now. Where do you think we are then? Thinking about that other side of what you work on other than your company, the more advisory stuff and the patient advisory stuff at that kind of C-suite level and things. Like, as a healthcare system, where do you think we are with our, it seems a bit strong to say this, but like with our respect for that voice? I guess I don't mean it as strong as that, because I'm sure that voice has always and will be respected, but I'm sure there's levels to that, because I mean, like we were just chatting about before, like that, I think when people say, "Oh, we're going to have like a patient panel," or we're going to, it's a bit tokenistic still. And bearing in mind, I work in marketing and events and things. I think even the way that it's presented sometimes is a little bit tokenistic, and people assume that when you say patient, it's, you know, 75-year-old Doris who, you know, you've just got to smile at and da-da-da. And it's like, no, it's like, no. And so my bias to this, based on what I see, is that I think we're a little bit immature in knowing and understanding what the patient voice actually means.
Yeah.
And I know you're going to be involved in the BMJ event, the BMJ Future Health event, who are, you know, very good at this, by the way, and not your normal event in the way that they approach it.
Yeah.
I should say that we're working with them on that as well, to be fully transparent. But I'm just interested in your perspective, because you're working for, you know, with a lot of different companies on this, and you've done various projects in various different spheres, and also you're you know, part of these panels and things. So where do you think we are now, and what does that transition look like to somewhere better?
I think when I speak of this, I first have to speak of how fortunate I am as a patient. You know, I was born with a very severe condition, yet the way I live my life is very parallel to how somebody completely normal would live their life. So first of all, I'm a very different type of patient to maybe what people are used to. Is, you know, I run my own company, you know, I have an education, I have all of these things, and it's because I've had the ability and the mobility to do that. So first of all, I'm very fortunate to have that ability, as it were, to blend in. So this might also come off a bit strong, but I do have that ability to blend in. And that is where I also think these companies are happy to bring me on board, is that I don't look like a patient. You know, I'm young, I'm a female, I've got an education, I've done things in the industry, I've worked in the industry, and, you know, I've worked, you know, and I have this ability, this agency. As like, some patients do not have that. They have mobility issues, you know, they're, you know, and things like that. And but I think, so first of all, I have to mention how fortunate I am to be in a position that most patients are not. Secondly, that informs how the industry looks at patients as well, is that, like you say, all patients are 75-year-old Doris. They're not. Patients are getting on with their lives, they're working at high level, you know, you're just speaking about your dad. He was a patient, you know, but he was working at such a high level, you know, but he did become a patient at one point in his life. And I think, you know, that's the part of being human, is at one point or another, we have that frailty, you know, that human frailty, and we will become a patient. But I think it's up to us as individuals to acknowledge that and to give ourselves the ability to advocate for what we want in the future when we do become a patient. You know, what level of care do you want to be receiving in the future? And I think everybody should be taking responsibility for that at the same time, and should be, you know, speaking in the industry, not just as an industry expert, but as a patient that one day will receive healthcare as well. It's about not just doing onto patients, you know, it's about patients being involved in that process and having some kind of control, you know, on what is happening to them. But I think equally it's the culture of the industry and of patients need to empower themselves. The industry needs to recognize that power and really partner with them. And I'll give you an example of where we are at, you know, in the industry. Yes, I work at this C-suite level, and I work, you know, at this operational level with health tech companies. But the other day I was invited to work with the NHS on a piece of policy, and we started the meeting and they disclosed that the piece of policy had already been written and was already undergoing being evaluated and was about to be published, but they just wanted to get our second opinion on it. So at that point, it was like, well, why am I here? Because all the decisions have already been made. So I'm sat here. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I contribute, whether it's valuable or not valuable. The decision has already been made. They might take it back and they might revise it by some things that we've already said. But does the NHS have the time to pull a policy publication and revise it because one patient said one thing that does have a part of interest? So that to me, and that happened very recently, you know, as recent as last month. So that's where we're at, maybe at a healthcare systems level. But in health tech, I have a very high involvement in what the decisions are made within that company. So it's interesting to see that the industry is already changing, and industry is already changing to make those partnerships with patients. And as we said before, you know, it's now becoming common sense. If you want to be a leader, if you want to move into this futuristic place, you know, partnering one-on-one with patients and really listening to what they have to say is going to be the future. But I don't believe healthcare systems have really caught up to that level yet.
It's it's this like big sigh, isn't it? Of, you know, I mentioned in that run up, you know, the tokenism and the you know, that kind of tick box nature, and what you experienced last month exactly feels like that. I think the reason that it's quite upsetting is, you're right. My dad's been a patient. We've all been a patient. I've been a patient. My mum's been a patient. And this is what I think people will not kind of understand, is that it's not them and us. Patients aren't a them group. Patients are us. We are them. It is you and I. It is the alternative version of me that got a diagnosis at birth that I didn't in this reality. It's still me. It's just that one is a patient and I'm not. It is me. And I think that's the difference that I think I'd like to see. And in terms of what I can do and what we are doing, particularly with SomX and the way that we're approaching this, is trying to plug that gap. It's saying that patients aren't a them group. They are our, i.e. the population, the people. They are our representative on that panel, speaking for us, which is all of us. And we are all one symptom and diagnosis away from being in that group. Like literally, we've all had a headache that lasted too long, or noticed blood here where there shouldn't be, and extrapolated in that moment to, you know, that could be colon cancer. That means a stone. That means surgery. That means this. That means a shorter life expectancy. We've all done that thought experiment after we've had symptoms that we're that close. We are that close. So that person with that is our representative. And I think then the conversation just becomes a lot more open, and it becomes a lot more kind of a lot more real, rather than kind of, I don't know what the right phrase would be, but to kind of look longingly at the patient panel and going, oh, I hope they're okay. Even you can think nice things, but like it's not they. It's not that they are us.
Exactly.
I don't know if I explained that very well, but like that's how I feel about it anyway.
Yeah, is that at one point or another we're all going to be, you know, in that position. I think another thing I'd like to maybe mention at this point is that there is also a stigma around the grateful patient. Is that you have received, you know, and this is a stigma that people, you know, go against me. And I've had healthcare leaders mention it to me and say these things to me. But, you know, people, because I received that life-saving treatment from the NHS, you know, of course I will be eternally grateful. But people believe the work I am doing is to criticize the NHS, and that, you know, I am not being grateful enough for that treatment that I received.
Interesting.
Sometimes that is what people have said to me. But in that moment, it's like, I would never criticize the NHS. You know, the fact is, I would be 6 foot in the ground without them. You know, that is a fact. And I would never criticize them. But the reason I do the work that I do is because I want every single patient to have the same access to care that I did when I was a child. So I'm not here to criticize the NHS or healthcare systems or health tech or the industry or anything like that. I am here to work with them because of that access, because I believe we can make it better. But because I have that stigma of, you're the grateful patient, we gave you this, we gave you your life, how dare you criticize, how dare you say things like that? That is a stigma that I still feel, and people have, you know, openly said to me, and I've had to say, actually, that's not what I'm here to do. So
yeah, I hadn't heard about that. I didn't know about that. That's
there is still there is still this culture of, we give you, you know, we help you, and you be eternally grateful. But I think
it's the we and you again. It's them and us again, isn't it?
Exactly. But I think as patients, what we need to be doing is empowering us and say, yeah, I am so grateful for the care that you gave me. You know, I am grateful for the care that you gave me. But let's make sure that the kids 10 years from now, born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, let's make sure they get the same care that I did. Let's not make sure they get the same care. Let's make sure they get the better care that I didn't get. You know, let's make sure we're bringing in the innovation so that, you know, it's better for them, and, you know, they have more dignified care and things like that. So that's
frankly
also
care that you and your family have paid for through their tax dollars, by the way.
I mean, so that's another,
like, it's not free. You know, anyway.
That's another conversation as well.
Before I alienate either the red side or the blue side, I don't know which side. I've got both in colours here if you're watching on YouTube, just to be clear. And I am probably somewhere right down the middle. But anyway, whole nother conversation. My politics is very confused. Can I talk to you a little bit about the patients as sort of commercializers here, or the sort of that commercial knowledge applied to sort of where you are, and I know you mentioned previously about like the cystic fibrosis community and what they've managed to do in that community. So fill in some gaps here for me in terms of the stuff we were speaking about before.
Yeah, I think this is a space that's really going to become prevalent within rare diseases and rare conditions and congenital conditions and things like that. Is that this is where, and we see great examples of it in the pharmaceutical company, where patients and pharmaceutical companies work together in partnership to get that commercialization completed. And, you know, one of those great examples was Vertex with NHS England and with NICE, is that, you know, it's that two sides of the coin, is that Vertex wanted their commercial contract from the NHS, you know, that let's not beat around the bush on that, you know, that this is healthcare, it is a business. On the flip side of that, cystic fibrosis patients needed those drugs in order to have an improved standard of life, an improved standard of care, to increase their life expectancy. So in that sense, patients and pharmaceutical companies are working together to get these drugs to market, you know, A, for the commercialization and the contract, B, to actually make a real difference in people's lives. And that is where I would say, do not underestimate how much of a commercial ally patients can be for you, especially if you're moving in that rare disease space, you know, because, you know, rare diseases, I mean, you look at my congenital condition, I mean, we are a tiny, tiny group. And because the surgeries do go over a whole lifetime, we know our surgeons, we know the researchers, we know our cardiac nurses, we know everybody in that community. And if you get everybody to unite, you know, they can be a real force when it comes to commercialization. So I would 100% do not underestimate. And I think this can also be a context that is also transferred to health tech as well, is like we were saying before, is that if you do not get the people on your app, if you do not get those conversion rates, if patients are, you know, not in the spaces that your app is or that your tool is, why would an ICB or why would a healthcare system license your app? You know, if you're not talking to patients, if you're not in those spaces, or again, if you're not talking to clinicians, if you're not speaking the clinician language, if you're, you know, if on the front line your app is useless or your software is useless, why would any healthcare system buy it from you? So I think that's where companies need to start wising up about who are your commercial allies. And in the future, it's going to be definitely patients and definitely clinicians.
Yeah. So this might be a really stupid question. Sorry for asking it. So could you just explain, like, what in that commercialization journey, I imagine that people will have an opinion on or just a thought on where they think patients fit into that. But specifically, because you've talked about NICE approval, there's also the kind of, you know, more on the ground getting a contract with a health tech company and just, you know, the patient, you know, the patient voice saying that this is a good thing and we use it or whatever it is. But like, there's probably quite a few places that patients can actually fit into this commercialization journey, both from like giving approval of the quality and informing the product, but then also driving demand enough so for NICE to sit up and look at it, for example. So like, what are those categories? Like, what broadly, where does the patient fit in, or can the patient fit in? Because the reason I ask the question is because, are we moving into a world where actually, and again, just throwing the view of 75-year-old Doris out the window, let's think about what an actual patient is. It is us. We are them. It's a version of us with the condition. You know, that person within a company, actually in some sort of permanent role, a chief patient officer, for example, something you've talked about before, becomes really interesting. So, you know, what would the job of a chief patient officer be, or how are those patients used or useful in that commercialization journey at the moment?
This is probably where I write my own job role within a health tech company for like a chief patient officer. Yeah, so we're just doing it. But it's difficult because I really see patients being effective and valuable in every stage.
Yeah.
You know, from innovation and concept, you know, through, I mean, obviously pharmaceuticals, potentially not with, you know, the chemicals and things like that, probably not that. But if you're developing a product, you know, that's going to be used, or a software or an app that's going to be used by clinicians or patients or things like that, then, you know, you will need them at the very beginning. With one health tech company, I actually assisted them and used a patient group as well, just to get the name right.
Interesting.
Just to get
now you're speaking
name.
my language.
Yeah.
Interesting. The value
just to get
of a
the
name
right, you know, because
talk me through that. That's really interesting. So what was I mean, obviously you might not give specifics.
Yeah, I won't get, but you know, we had this product, and you know, the product was about patient communication and all of that. But like I said, it had to be that two-way street. We had to get the patients on board with the app, with the software, in order for it to be licensed by a healthcare system. This company is a global company. They're not just looking at the NHS, they're looking at the Middle East, the US, all these different areas. So first of all, we had to make sure it was a global accessible name, across all languages, across all cultures. We had to make sure it was accessible to every single patient.
People don't think about this, People, that is such an obvious thing. So for the health tech companies listening, this is such an obvious thing that when we're in a naming exercise, we think about, and obviously we do, but what geographies are you looking to go in? Because as soon as you start saying, China, Japan, all of a sudden now there's certain consonants and vowel structures that you can't use. I think the famous one on this was, I think, Xbox, the Microsoft Xbox. It was a code name until they realized it was one of the only things that actually would represent the product and be able to be spoken in all languages, and actually they ended up keeping it. I think it might be folklore, but I think there's some truth behind it. But yeah, no, it's absolutely right. All of a sudden you're like, oh, this can't actually be said in the country that I'm launching into. So we've now got a massive problem.
And we had to make sure it was friendly. If I had that app on my phone, would I open it up? Would I trust them to talk to them about my medical issues? Would I trust them to divulge this kind of information, or have that diagnostics? Does it spark that, trustness between a patient and an app? So then we had to think about those sorts of things as well. So that was really interesting, that just that naming exercise, we had to bring on board, not just myself, I couldn't just be the voice of every single patient in the UK, Middle East, and the US. We had to look at different demographics and look at different patient groups and really ask them, is this an app that, if it was launched, would you download it? Would you think, what, that's great, I'll use that for whatever I need, I'll use that for my diagnostics or whatever. So when I talk about the innovation stage, it is something very simple as getting the name right. It's really, so it can be that first, and then also it's about the business model. Then we have to talk about the business model. So that is a very simple business model, is if you don't get patients on your app, no one's going to buy it. So then you have to think about positioning potentially your whole business model around, how are you going to get patients to use your tool? How are you going to bring them on board? How are you going to get them into interact? And that's the same with pharmaceuticals as well. How are you going to get them to the clinical trial? How are you going to get them to engage in you? Do they trust you? Would I go for a clinical trial if it was, big pharma's got a bad rep, so would I feel comfortable going for a clinical trial? But if there were other patients, and if there was that engagement, and if there were people from my community potentially leading that clinical trial, then maybe I'd say, yeah, okay, I've known them for a really long time. They're a good friend. They helped me through a difficult time when I was struggling with my rare disease at this point in my life. And now they're telling me how great this pharmaceutical company is. And now they're telling me about this clinical trial that could increase my life expectancy and things like that. Then maybe I would think, yeah, actually, I'll go for that. I'll give it a try and see, if it does improve my life. So I think, it's going to be all stages. And then as you move from, piloting to procurement, we saw the 2023 Procurement Act come out, ironically came out in 2024. And that, that really speaks about long-term patient outcomes and public health goals. So if, we're now seeing procurement, we're now seeing tendering processes are asking questions like, what are your readmission rates? What are the reconsultation rates? How does this help me move into the community? How does it help me move, healthcare systems from a reactive state to a proactive state? So even procurement is asking all these questions about, how are you involving patients in a meaningful way? And how, it used to be cheap is best. That's not what's happening anymore at all. And especially if you go to the Middle East, they are very big on value-based procurement, and we see it already creeping in to the NHS. And especially with that Procurement Act, we see it becoming, law at this point. So even at that tendering process, you need to be having patients on board and telling you what are the long-term outcomes as well. So I really think, I would love to give advice and say, you need them here, or you need them there, or you need them, but you really need them along the whole journey.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the thing, is that if you do bring patients along on the whole journey, when it comes to commercialization and getting that contract, who are going to be the biggest advocates? Who are going to stand up there in Parliament and say, we want these drugs, we want this device, it's going to save our life. We have worked with this company for 10 years. We have worked with them, helped them develop this device. Who is going to be the loudest voice when it comes to commercialization and it comes to you getting your reimbursement for that 5-year process or 10-year process? It's going to be the patients that you brought on board at the beginning.
Mm. Yes. God, I love so much about what you just said. The fact that patients should be all across the company is something that I think is only going to become more and more, I'm going to use the word obvious. And I see this in marketing, right? Obviously, that's the world that I'm in, and communications, in that we're starting to see AI creep into lots of, almost all areas. In fact, I probably would say all areas of companies. And things, and there's value to that, obviously, or else it wouldn't be happening. There's values in efficiency, there's values in productivity, there's value. Also, though, there is value in creativity, and that's because humans are freed up to do the human thing. And the way I see this play out in marketing is that with AI doing a lot more of the repetitive stuff and the grind and all the stuff that doesn't actually necessarily need a human, the humans are free to do more human things, right? Now, I think a chief patient officer that works across the business is a highly concentrated version of that, in the sense that what they have is exactly what AI does not have, in that they have up-to-date, hyper-recent context on one hand, and they also have, with other humans, trust. And that's to connect with them, that's to deliver information as distribution, that's to bring other humans to the table that also have context and trust with other people, and lots of things. And I don't see, at least at the moment, a way of AI replacing that. And actually, that context and trust and human touch from that chief patient officer is then driving, and in my mind, it's in marketing terms here, is then driving so much of what currently AI can't do, which we at SomX are split into basically psychology, culture, and timing. And that kind of cultural nuance that comes with existing in a patient group, the language, the body language, the places that they go, identity, expression, all those things that are so highly nuanced. For a company to have a chief patient officer that is advising on that, and that's just in marketing. The level of trust that organization can then embody and adopt and express to bring other people to the table is perfectly highlighted in what you just said about a naming exercise. Because all of that goes into just that one exercise, which is the big name above the door. But we know that name above the door can be said in all the right languages. We know it's inviting. We know it doesn't step on any bizarre cultural or religious things that might be an issue, or like there's so much baked into it. And it just, I think, highlights the importance and I guess how humans are being elevated into companies that have this stuff. It's it's why internally I'm saying, like, if you're going to events and you're speaking to human beings, you're far more like valuable here like at the moment, because I can't replicate that. Like it's impossible. There's a lot that I can, but that speaking to people and building network and relationships, and it's an example, I think, of AI freeing us up to be more human, and it's an example of like showing actual value there. But I do think that's wonderful. You mentioned the Middle East. I think that's it's an interesting one. Have you done much work out there?
I think where I got my inspiration was from for the Middle East is during my MBA, we had to do kind of a research stint in the Middle East. So I got introduced, the country that I chose was the UAE. And, we were so privileged. We went into some of the biggest hospitals in the UAE. We got to go to the Department of Health in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. We got to look at where policy was being made. We got to look at their, 2030 vision and things like that. We went to M42, Mubadala. So we looked at all the funding streams that were happening.
Wow.
And we really took a really in-depth look of, what was happening over there. And I think what really mesmerized me about that was the cohesion. It was this cohesive path of everything fed into each other so that we got innovation to the patient. And that is really one of my biggest values, is about how do we move as fast as possible in a safe manner, to get it to the patient, because we're looking at, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to get an innovation to a patient is 1 to 3 years. We're looking in the NHS 5 to 10 years. And if you take the extremes of those two, we're looking at a 9-year gap. And, 9 years can be the difference between a patient living or dying. It can be the difference between
significant part of the life expectancy. Yeah.
It can be the difference between a patient living for 9 years with heart failure. It could be a real big difference. And then that comes into the whole other landscape of productivity. What are they giving back to society in a financial way? Things like that. If you've got someone who's fit and healthy going back to work, then you've got higher productivity rates, but if you've got someone who is not able to take on a full-time role, is not able to, even, I don't want to say this in a cynical way, but give back to the tax system and things like that, then, you're putting your country at financial risk and at productivity risk. So it feeds into the whole socio-economic thing. People don't realize how important health is to creating a productive country, to having a financially stable economy, things like that. I think health is really sometimes put at the bottom of the list when sometimes it is the most important factor to making sure your country is running successfully. So that was something that I really found really interesting. And on my MBA, I got to work on, multiple, and even now some of the health tech companies that I work with, we're now moving into Saudi Arabia and things like that. I got a deep understanding of, the Saudi Arabia system and how they're working in their innovation space and things like that. And people say, well, it's the money, they have a higher amount of money to invest in these things. But I also believe it's the culture.
I was going to ask this. This is actually what I was going to ask. Like, which one of those two is it? Because I hear a lot that they're able to leapfrog. They're able. This leapfrog thing keeps coming up. Leapfrog. Like that they're able to skip over our kind of like industrial revolution and just go for the high tech stuff. So they don't have these decrepit old buildings with poor infrastructure. They can just build from scratch because of the money. You've alluded to culture there, but you've also alluded to I want to call it like political responsibility, almost like the government has taken responsibility for the fact that if we have a healthy population, we'll get back from that. I think that's a level of, I guess, maturity that I certainly don't feel like we have that here. It feels like we're very individualistic with health in the UK still, of like health affects me, I want it solved, I want to do in the government saying, well, we will help you. It's not we will help you to help us again, and us being the broader population and become a better country and all the rest of it. When I don't think we're quite there. So is it fair to say like that's how it felt, and that's kind of where they're at?
Yeah, it just felt like the culture. I think it's just like, the way they've opened up sandboxes, the way they have a clear strategy for how to get a company from piloting to procurement. I feel like that is still a very fragmented system here in the UK, because I feel like in my own company, in companies that I'm working in now, it's like, okay, we'll work with this trust, we'll work with this trust, we'll get this data, but then that data needs to be replicated here. And there are some amazing things coming out from the NHS, you know, like the innovation passport, you know, things like that, to try and get these things a bit more centralized and get that cohesion into place. But I still feel like it's a bit more fragmented in comparison to these other countries. And like you say, is that I feel they have this understanding of good health is good for everybody. You know, there's a wider benefit to having a healthy population.
Yeah.
And even when I went to, you mentioned before, when I went to India to do pitching for my company, when I went there, this might be a bit of a political gripe, or I don't know, but I'll say it, we can always edit it out later. But when I went there, you know, they had a department it was actually called entrepreneurship and disability. It was like kind of the words, I can't remember exactly what the department was called, but that's kind of what it was. And it was all about giving opportunities to people with disabilities.
Wow.
You know, it wasn't about, you know, we'll give you money and blah, 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 and you survive. It was about giving people opportunities to go out, be productive, work for themselves, add to the economy, things like that. And I think, you know, as someone who has lived, you know, through that adversity and has been held back by my own health, I've had to make my own opportunities, and I've had to really push myself really hard to go out there and get those opportunities and make something of my life, you know what I mean? And that's a passion that I've always had. That's what I wanted from life, is that I wanted those opportunities. But I think if we went from you know, it goes back to that culture thing of they need help, they need this, they need that, instead of let's give them some opportunities. Let's give them the opportunity to, you know, to participate. And then that's where we come back to this patient thing, is that if we have more and more patients engaging in health, then we are giving people opportunities, whether it's through remuneration, whether it's through voice. Sometimes it's just through purpose. Sometimes we just need to give people a purpose. And that's where we are looking at, you know, having a whole population who for years have just been, you know, I mean, we can even look through, if you want to go really back, you know, back to the 90s when we had the riots, you know, disabled community was, you know, protesting, saying that they wanted more accessibility in public spaces and things like that. You know, that's what this next stage of healthcare could give to people, is those opportunities. I feel I've gone on a very big tangent and rabbit hole there, I love I feel like it does come back in a circle, you know what I mean?
No, it does, because it's brought us back to where we were at the start with what the identity of a patient is, and how the you know, the Doris identity. And by the way, like, I'm not throwing shade on people called Doris that may or may not be 75. Like, you can be a patient too. It's just one of. And I think it's given me a really, really interesting idea for something that I think we could do campaign wise to actually start to change opinion on this. But I think that's wonderful. And that was the point I was going to make, because I think with what you just talked about, we can start to change people's view of what a patient is. And that then stops us, you know, looking at those panels with puppy dog eyes and going, oh, isn't that nice? Like that isn't productive. No, that isn't productive. That's very, like, we're not. I don't want to create these environments where it's like we're there to feel sorry for the patients, and they're there to soak up the good wishes and da da da. It's like, no, we, like, that's not. It's not. I mean, that probably does look like progress in some areas, to be fair, but there's other versions of this progress that actually I think start with it, perhaps with it, what we've talked about is perhaps a change in identity of how we view patients, which I think is really interesting. I've learned so much here, Olivia. Thank you so much for coming on. I want to ask you one more thing, because I think you're so tied into actually the policy, finance, commercialization. You're tied into health tech as well. You're tied into everything we've talked about from the patient side and lived experience. And so I'm interested to hear when you hear things like an extra 10 billion of investment into the NHS, I'm interested. In fact, I'm really interested in what you think of this, because you hold such, I think, a unique view and an informed view on so much of this. That is that like is it positive? How positive? What how do you think about this? And how would you spend the 10 billion? How would you spend the 10 billion, Olivia? No, you don't need to answer that. But
no, I don't want to. I'll be honest with you, is that I know we should be celebrating that we are getting this money to, further our, healthcare system. I think terrified is probably a bit too strong, but I do have concerns. And I have concerns that this money could either really do some amazing work and we could really get to the place we need to be to ensure that we have, a future-proofed healthcare system, and if it's done right, everything that we wish for as patients, as individuals, going back to that circle of productivity and things like that, we could have the loop, closed, and it could be amazing. But I just feel if we are not doing that inclusive piece, if we are not asking the right questions, I am concerned that we are going to be creating policy, strategy. We're going to be bringing in software that, when it rolls out on the day, clinicians can't use it, patients don't want to interact with it, and we can't get it over the infrastructure that we already have in, and we have the barriers that we already have to innovation are not, brought down. I am super concerned that we could see that money go into a black hole, and we could be either in a worse state or we could be in the same state that we're in at the moment. And I think that's where we seriously need to be looking at our past mistakes, and we need to be looking at the cultures that we hold, the beliefs that we hold around stakeholders. We need to be looking into the future of who is going to be, what are the power dynamics between stakeholders? Because we're now looking at a place where patients used to have a parental relationship with their doctor, where doctors led the conversation. We're now looking at a place where patients are in a place of partnership, and that's because of patients' access to digital, to literature, to things like that. And then, of course, we're also trying to move healthcare into the community and look at it as a more proactive state. Well, who's going to do the heavy work of that? It's patients. Patients need to know how to self-manage themselves. They need to know how to monitor themselves. They need to be educated. They need to be given information at their health literacy level as well, so that they can have these informed and involved conversations. And I think the generations to come are becoming more interested in health, so I think it will naturally happen anyways. Yeah. But I also think there needs to be an effort from the government to really educate the population moving forward as well. And that's when we could see our system becoming less stressed. We could see people, because they're self-managing themselves so well, they don't go to A&E, they don't go to the GP. They know what their boundaries are, or if they do need diagnostics, they're doing it all at home. And like people who are in that specialist high tertiary care, like myself, we are very good at self-managing our condition because we've had it our whole lives. We have to do it. And we see our consultant once a year. We have all the tests, and that's it. We go home, we live our lives. I don't see the GP. I see him for a flu jab, and that's about it, because we are so aware of our condition. And that's where we need to get everybody else to a position, that everybody else is in that informed position where they're just going to the doctors maybe, if something, like you say, if there's blood coming from somewhere it shouldn't, or if there is a broken arm or things like that, that's when we should be going to the doctors. So I think if we do it right, we get the engagement right, and, we really learn from our lessons in the past, I think we could be looking at a phenomenal way of spending that money and using it. But I am concerned that, cultures might hold us back, beliefs might hold us back, not using common sense. You know, it would be frustrating if we didn't see common sense come into play when we're spending that money.
Mm. And of course, health being so politicized, common sense is relegated behind what statistics can I repeat at PMQs for how that money was spent.
Yeah.
Honestly, I've learned so much, Olivia. Thank you so much for coming on. It's an interesting time, I think, for us to be having the conversation about where patients are in our healthcare system. It's only going to improve. It's only going to get better, I think. Optimistically, I do think that the advent of AI is pushing us more to a place of valuing human experience, because frankly, human experience is starting to be a differentiator in strategy, because a lot of the doing is done at the same level now with AI. That's been sort of democratized. And actually, when it comes to something as specific as the experience of a patient on a drug or after a procedure or whatever it is, that can only be delivered by those people that have been through it very, very recently, or in a specific environment, or in a specific space, or whatever it is. So I think if there's one thing that I think I want people to take away from this episode, is it's that we are them, they are us. If you go to a patient, if you go to a panel and there's a patient on there, they are you. They are your representative, because you are spotting one thing away from that. So we that is our community, and we need to start behaving more in that way, I think. And I think there's a lot of positivity downstream of that. Olivia, thank you. If people want to get in touch with you, I'm sure they will, by the way. If people want to get in touch with you, whether that's for some of your advisory and consultancy work, whether that's about your company on the gown side, what's the best way for them to find you?
I suppose LinkedIn is probably, that's my go-to platform. And then I'm happy to have a conversation, and then share my email, and hopefully we can have a conversation and, talk about this direction and this future that, we should all be attempting to build together, really. That's the only way we're going to make it happen. And, I want to obviously reiterate that I want everything that I have said in this conversation, I'd love it to be taken in a very positive light. And I want it to also be said, I have gone backwards and forwards about this conversation in my own career. Forget that anything happened to me as a kid and all of that. And I've gone backwards and forwards in my career, but as I've seen more and more of the industry, as I've worked more and more in the industry and watched it, unravel, I've really seen that this is a thread that is just going to become more and more prominent in the future. So that's when I did make the clear decision. It might be a scary decision to make, that, I was going to stick by, my values and my morals and what I think is going to bring the most value during my lifetime and my career, and help, whether it's health tech, pharmaceuticals, even patients and patient associations, how do we all work together to get to the place that we want to be in the future?
Amazing. It's been a real pleasure, Olivia. Thank you.
No problem at all.